up in 1 Timothy chapter 3. Verses 1 through 13. Looking at qualifications or the qualities that a leader must possess in the church. Paul doesn't write a manual here. People have used this as a manual for offices and duties and stuff like that. This is not a manual. This is not it only describes maybe one duty, one person's duty, or one office's duty, or one official leadership position's duty. And Paul does that actually a little bit later on in his writing to Timothy. But these are pastoral epistles, so it has to do with somewhat with things that go on within the church. But what Paul does instead is he gives us the qualities that a leader must possess. He says in verse 1, the saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be beyond reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders or have a good reputation, so that he may not fall into disgrace and into the snare of the devil. Deacons likewise must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. They must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. And let them also be tested first. Then let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. Their wives likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. And let deacons be the husband of one wife, managing their children and their own households well. For those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves, and also great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. As I said earlier, these are qualities. Excuse me. Man, I should have moved that before I coughed. These are qualities that make up and that a leader in the church should possess. It's not a manual. Before I go much further with these qualities, let me just describe a few things and touch on a few things that this passage brings up to everyone. Got to remember, when we look at this thing where he says overseer, sometimes translated as bishop, sometimes translated by people as pastor or used to refer to a pastor. When it says deacons, that sometimes people mean that to be an office of a deacon. They interpret it that way. It may be an office of a particular office of a deacon. It may be referring to something else, because deacon means servant. So it could be an official position. It could be a description of what all leadership is, because all leaders are servants, and servant first and foremost. The reason I say that is because structures in the church aren't as important as the message. Okay? Offices and positions in the church are secondary to the message. Paul wrote this. He said this. He said, I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some, and I do it for the sake of the gospel. You see, the principle that that Paul is speaking here and talking about is that the message is more important than how you get it across. That methods, when he says I become all things to all people, it doesn't mean he becomes a drunk to drunkards. It doesn't mean he becomes, loose to other people. I mean, it doesn't mean all of that. It means he does whatever it takes to identify with people so he can get the message across to them. You don't have to compromise your moral standards. You do not have to compromise your faith to identify with people so that you can get the message across. Methods change over time. The methods of communication and the methods of getting the gospel across change over time, and they change based on many different factors. Some of it's the needs of the church and the community at that time. During the Great Depression, soup kitchens and stuff, churches started, and they still continue today. That was a means of meeting people's needs in order to share the gospel message. Most recently, you'll remember when radio. Do y'all remember when radio first came out? Any of y'all that old? Not me. Preachers were against the radio because that was Satan's box. Till they realized that they could get their message across on the radio to many different people. So preachers started going on the radio. You remember TVs? TVs were the devil. I know some of y'all heard preachers say that. Yeah, that's Satan's box right there for sure. The radio isn't anymore, but that's Satan's box right there. Till they realized that they could get their message across to more people that way, so they started using television. Then it became the internet. Oh, the internet's straight from hell, straight from Satan. I mean, you can't be on the internet. Now what are we doing? It was a need in the church. Let me explain it. COVID, 2 years ago. Didn't know what was going on, didn't know how serious it could be, didn't know how deadly it could be, how contagious it was, didn't understand it at all, so people stayed at home. How else are you going to get the message out? Not every church can do TV, but just about everybody can do internet now. So now we stream on the internet. We're not only live on Facebook. Later today or tomorrow morning, one of the two, or this evening sometime, it's going to be posted on YouTube. Gives you more opportunities to get the message. Sometimes it's the need. Sometimes it's the culture. Paul says, I become all things to all people. He stood in a square with a bunch of gods around him and statues around him. There was the unknown God, and he used that as his springboard. Let me tell you something. The gospel is not meant to go out there and fight the culture. The gospel's meant to save souls. So when you go into a place, one of the things missionaries have to learn to do is not to take the culture of the United States into a foreign country and into their culture. Went to Turkey. I went on a mission trip to Turkey. Turkey's an Islamic state now. They got the big dome temple, the blue dome or whatever it's called. I went in it. It ain't fascinating. Just a big bunch of things, big old huge ceiling with a bunch of wires across it and little bitty lights and stuff. It wasn't fascinating. It made me take my shoes off and all this other stuff to go in it. And I'm like, this ain't enough. This Biltmore House was a lot more interested in that. And that was somebody who was spending his own money on himself. That was a lot more interesting than that place. But it's an Islamic culture. Well, when the missionaries go there, do you realize for the first year, they're not allowed to have a car? Did you realize that? For the first year, the Foreign Mission Board will not, or International Mission Board, will not allow them to have a car. They have to use public transportation. They have to identify themselves with the culture that they're in and be accepted and find ways to get themselves accepted and identified within that culture, and then they use that culture to present the gospel. Somebody asked me, said, can you take Bibles over there when you go? Nope. You be able to do Bible studies and revival? Nope. They can sit there and read a Bible. You can have a Bible in Turkey. You can sit out there and read it. If somebody comes up to you and asks you what you're reading, you can tell them all you want as long as they're 18 years old or older. So you got to get yourself adapted into that culture. So cultural things will be based on how you do it. If you're going to have a church established there, you've got to get a license from the state. The state has to recognize that church and make it a legal church. So you know what they do? Their whole goal is to start house churches. House churches. What they look for is to get about 10, 15 people, 20 people in a house church. Get that going. And then hopefully from that church get a few more people to go over here and maybe start another church in their house of about 10, 15, 20 people. And that's what they do. Now over here in the United States, we got 30 people here, 30-something people here this morning. We're considered a little church, and, here in the United States among churches, we're considered somewhat insignificant. I hate to say it. But you look at all the big churches out there, we're insignificant to them. You go into Turkey, that's significant, those home churches. It's the difference in the culture. So culture will make how you do it and how you set it up. The methods change and how you go about it changes. But the gospel stays the same. The gospel message is Jesus crucified and risen, and no missionary will alter that gospel message to anyone for any reason. You apply this to the church structure. You have in our denomination pastors, deacons, and then somebody else within the church. You go into another church and you go over to an Episcopal church, they may have a pastor, they may have somebody else with some other title that is leading that church because they can't afford somebody with the rank of pastor. And then you got a bishop that may be over them all. You go into the next denomination, the bishop is the one over the local church. And they don't have deacons. They have elders. So it's different. It's different. The structure in the church becomes the avenue through which the gospel is taken out. And those structures change and grow and adapt. And in Paul's day, the church was young. It was still growing. It was still changing. It was still developing into some sort of structure as it grew. Because as it grows, it's going to have be some sort of organizational structure to it. So it was developing. So when Paul talks about overseers and deacons, it doesn't necessarily mean what we think of as a deacon. And it may not necessarily mean what we think of as a pastor. Then again, it could. It just depends. It just depends. But there's something that doesn't change. There's something that never changes. That is the qualifications or the qualities that a leader in the church must possess. They never change. And that's why Paul, instead of addressing really, if he was going to address who was the most important in the church, the most important leaders in those churches, it wouldn't be deacons. It would have been the teachers in chapter 1. They were the ones that had the most influence. Those that wanted to be teachers, they had more influence than the deacons in the church. We as Baptists got it all backwards. We think deacons are the big power thing. No, the power's in the teachers. Power, they're the ones that are influencing more. So he'd have went there, but he doesn't. He talks about bishops or overseers, pastors, and he talks about deacons or servants. Let me mention those a little bit. Let me get to those right quick. Because these things change, but let me go ahead and touch on these right quick. He says in verse 1, he talks about an overseer or a bishop. That comes from the word episcope, which means to have oversight or to oversee, to be an overseer or to supervise something. It's been traditionally interpreted as a pastor or a bishop, depending on the denominational structure. But the primary role, and this is the one that has a role to it, the primary role of this servant is to oversee the life of the church, to oversee the direction of the church, and to oversee the well-being of the church and its people. And the primary duty of this person is to preach and teach the Word of God. That's the one office that doesn't change. I don't care what you call it. I don't care if you're one of those out there. Well, I don't like them calling them apostles, because apostles don't exist anymore. The apostles were in the biblical days. They're done. You're not an apostle now, but you can be a bishop, you can be an elder, you can be a pastor, you can be this, you can be a father, you can be whatever you want to be called. But there has to be someone that leads the overall church and maintains and watches out for their well-being and the direction of the church through the preaching and teaching of the Word, because it's the preaching of the Word, Paul says, it's through the foolishness of preaching that God has chosen to get the gospel message out and to save people. And he tells Timothy in his second letter, he tells Timothy, he says, I charge you in the presence of God, preach the Word. Be ready in season and out of season. Preach the Word at all times, whether you feel like it or not. Whether it's you're fully prepared or not. Whether it's acceptable or not. Whether they will let you or not. Preach the Word. Paul was an example because Paul preached the Word whether they let him or not. In prison, he still preached the Word to the prisoners and to the guards. Peter preached the Word to the prisoners and the guards when he was in prison. Whether it's acceptable, whether it's cool, or whether it's not. Preach the Word. It's the primary role of that person. That's the one area that seems to be unchanging, the one part that is absolutely necessary. But then he mentions deacons. He says deacon. And I'm just going to be honest with you. I'm going to tell you my honest thoughts on this thing for deacons. I don't think Paul's describing an office within the church. Because the word diakonos means to be a servant, to be a waiter of tables, to be one who runs errands for someone and performs menial tasks. So all these people don't say, I'm deacon so-and-so, or I'm the chairman of the deacon board. Well, you're the bottom of the totem pole. You're below the ones washing feet. Because Jesus gave an example of what a leader is. What a leader in the church is someone who has the heart of a servant. Jesus, with his disciples, looked at them one day and said, you know, the rulers of the Gentiles lord their authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must first be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must first be your slave. Because the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. Later on, he was with the disciples, and he laid his coat on the ground, and he knelt down at their feet and started to wash their feet, and Peter refused, and he said, well, if y'all don't let me wash your feet, you have nothing to do with me. He said, well, wash all of me, Peter. When Jesus was done, he looked at his disciples and he said, do you understand what I've done? You call me teacher and Lord. Okay, he's God himself. And you are right because I am. And if I then be your Lord and teacher and have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should also do just as I have done to you. A servant. We went to the Biltmore house. Walked into George Vanderbilt's bedroom. Looked over, and there was this canopy bed over there. And I looked at it and I said, that thing is tiny. It's really, really little. Well, we turned our little thing on because they don't have people telling you about it now. You get to listen to what they have to say. And it said, the bed you see is a regular size, queen size bed. It just looks small because of the vastness of the room. The size of the room and the height of the ceiling made it look really, really small. Later on, we went into the servants' quarters. Now, some of them had it pretty good compared to some of the other places they had been in, but their service quarters was this. They had a sink in there. They had a bathroom in there, had their own little bathroom. Each one of them had their own bath, had their own sink. They had a little dresser with a mirror, and they had a single bed. And that was all they had. That's our place as a leader. Not in the Vanderbilt suite, but in the servants' quarters. That's what Jesus was telling. Because he came down from glory to be a servant and to show us what we are to be. In other words, a leader in the church, first of all, has to be a humble servant to people. That's what Jesus demonstrated to us. So to me, I'm just going to tell you my honest belief, that term deacon is not describing an office in the church. The office of deacons is describing the qualities of all leaders within the church. Overseer is describing one particular position, but this one is describing all of them, because everybody has. If you're going to be a leader in the church, you have to first of all be a servant. You have to realize that it's not about you, it's about God. You have to realize it's not about you, it's about others. And you have to be a humble servant. You know why I don't like foot washing ceremonies. Okay? Seen them in churches. I've seen them online. I haven't been to one. And I won't go to one, and I won't participate in one, because they're full of pride. They're full of pride. You know the reason that person's getting down there and washing that person's feet is out of pride, so that you will see them doing that. That's not humility. That's not a servant. A servant works behind the scenes and doesn't care. A servant's behind the scenes and doesn't care. All they care about is washing the feet. And do you realize that foot washing was about the lowest on the totem pole in the household? It's one of the dirtiest jobs in the household. That's how low of a servant you need to be. That's the humbleness of a servant's heart. So when you look at all the qualities of a leader and the characteristics of a leader that are listed here, and we're going to go through them real quickly in just a moment, you got to remember each one of these is coupled with having a humble servant's heart. So when he says an overseer or the pastor or the bishop must be beyond reproach, this is a person with whom no charge of immorality can be brought against. You can't go out there and rightfully claim that they have any immorality about them. Now, if they do, you can claim it. But they shouldn't have that there. It shouldn't be a part of who they are so that you can claim that. I know many preachers out there that are blatantly moral in some areas that everybody thinks are taboo, and immoral in other areas, and everybody ignores it. Because I'm going to get to a couple of them here that I see them immorally in. He says above reproach must be the husband of one wife. You know, I didn't think about this until just this past week. The focus of this issue here is not whether they are married or not. And it's not on the gender of the spouse. The focus is on the commitment that comes with marriage. That's the thing about it. The commitment. When you're married, you're committed to that one person. You're a one person. A one-woman man or a one-man woman, whatever you want to call it, however you want to interpret it. You're committed to that one person. And you're committed completely to that one person and faithfully committed to that one person. Do you realize that Jesus and the Bible pictures the relationship of the church with Christ as a marriage, a bride and a bridegroom committed to one another? This is the thing. If a pastor, and it says the same thing about deacons or about all servants, you don't have to be married. But if you're not committed to that one person, you don't have that committed to that one person, how can you be committed to God's church? I had to learn this. The commitment level to the church is you're committed to that church where you're at. And you're not constantly comparing and looking around and comparing to other churches and seeing whose church is better and all this other stuff, or even looking for a better church. I've been guilty of that. I've been guilty of that. You're committed to that church so that that church and those people and God knows that you're committed to them. That's why the importance of the husband and one wife is so important. It's that commitment to that one person. Doesn't mean I don't think it means they haven't been divorced or even divorced and remarried. I think it's, are you committed now? Are you committed now? You may disagree with me, and that's fine. I don't bring the issue up and I don't push the issue because it's not a hill to die on. But the hill to die on is, are you committed? Are you committed? He says sober-minded. That means to be able to think clearly, to be alert, to be aware of what's going on around you, both physically and spiritually. Self-controlled, that you're not apt to fluctuate between extremes emotionally from one end to the other constantly. To be respectable, to be hospitable, kind, always seeking to be helpful and generous to those around you, those in need and those visiting. To not be a drunkard, not be addicted to alcohol or really addicted to anything. Some translations have for the pastor, for the overseer, that not to be given to wine at all, and for the deacon, not to be given to much wine. The issue here is the control issue. Is God controlling you, or is something else controlling you in your life? And someone that's drunk or is addicted to something, they are being controlled by that other. Remember, he says we are to be someone that's in self-control. Paul says, I bring my body under subjection. Bring myself under control. Sometimes we lose control. That happens. But it shouldn't be a constant thing. He says violent. Not violent, but gentle. That word violent means prone to either violent outbursts or anything like that, but it also means to be a bully. To use your position or your power and force to get your way. Isn't a lot of preachers out there that way? Haven't you seen them? A lot of deacons out there that way? A lot of church leaders out that way? They want to use their authority and their power to force people and bully people around. But instead, they must be gentle in spirit towards others. Be gentle towards others. Don't be quarrelsome, argumentative about things. Don't be greedy, not driven by money or possessions. How many out there are greedy and driven by money and possessions? I know a lot of them. I know one in particular. I'm not going to say who it is because somebody here would know him. But I know one in particular that's driven that way. Let me tell you, all I need is enough money to pay my taxes, put some in savings, and survive. That's all I need. I don't want a whole lot of money. Must manage his own household well with all dignity, keeping his children of submissiveness. This is also of a deacon as well, of other servants. So you got to manage the affairs of your home. If you can't manage the affairs of your home, you can't manage the affairs of a church. You must have the respect of your family and your children. That's what it means by keeping them under submission and being submissive and being obedient. That they have enough respect for you that they will follow you and obey in obedience to you. Doesn't mean that you rule over them with an iron fist and that they cower because you can't control your kids but just so much. You really can't. But do they respect you enough? Do they respect you as a parent? Because if you don't have that in the family, you won't have that in the church. Can't be a recent convert. Can't be somebody young in the faith because they're too easy to fall into condemnation. Too easy to get tripped up theologically in different ways. But they also must be well thought of, have a good reputation outside in the community. They need to have a good reputation outside. That means the community sees them the same way you do. And he says deacons, he says they must be dignified. He keeps going. All of these can apply to every one of them. Dignified, honorable, honest, worthy of respect. Honorable and honest, worthy of respect. A good way to say that is a person of integrity and trustworthiness. Someone that's not double-tongued, that's double-talk, that says one thing and does another and says something and really means it. I was watching a TV show the other day. It's one of my favorite sci-fi shows called Warehouse 13. And the guy was on the phone and somebody had sent him a letter. He was a congressman and he says, I'll take care of that and I'll look into it. And he sat there and he tore the letter up. He didn't really mean it. Say what you mean. If you want, you mean it. But you're not a gossip either. Or slandering. Hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. That means to be mature in the faith. Clear conscience, not harboring any guilt of sin, not harboring it within, and not being able to have a charge brought against you in it, but blameless. Their wives, he talks to the women as wives are women that actually serve in different areas of the thing. The same things, the same qualities must be exhibited in their wives and in their spouse, because you know what? A spouse can ruin a leader. I've seen many wives ruin pastors in their churches because they were not honorable and integrity. They were slanderers. They weren't faithful in a lot of things. Same level of commitment. And then he says something interesting in verse 13. He says, "For those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves, and also great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus." I looked it up. I looked it up in the Greek Bible. That word, serve well as deacons, that word deacons is not in there. What it literally says in the Greek, those who serve well gain a good standing for themselves. Those who serve well, those who are servants, those who have the servant's heart within them, gain a good standing and gain confidence in their faith. Because these are the people who are truly respected, people of integrity, people of trustworthiness, people of faith, people that are committed to God and to His church. You see, Paul and Timothy were dealing with just the opposite. They were dealing with hard-headed people that wanted to be leaders in the church, but they didn't understand what it meant to be a leader in the church. They didn't understand that it meant to be a servant first of all. And that's why Paul lays out these qualities that must be in that person, because that person must be a servant. It's good to aspire, to desire, as long as God lays it on your heart for those areas and God leads it. Because those that are servants' hearts are going to do what the master asked them to do. And the master is God Himself. And what Paul's doing here and laying these out here is so that in addressing those that are there now and those that come in the future, that they will possess the qualities that are needed within the church, because that is vital. The leaders and their qualities are vital. Vital to the success and the life and the well-being of that church. We're going to close. We're not going to do an invitation. We're just going to close this morning, if that's okay, Peggy. We're just going to close with this. A time of prayer. Praying for our church, for leaders within our church and those within our church that lead in our church. And I ask you to covet your prayers for me.